A buzzing cloud of angry bees swarmed out of the overturned beehive, chasing Ms. Perkins, the neighborhood HOA president, across my lawn. She shrieked, tripping over a garden gnome and landing right in a patch of petunias, a sticky, golden mess of honey all over her designer clothes. It was a sight that would be forever burned into my memory. Ms. Perkins, usually so prim and proper, flailing wildly as bees dive-bombed her, their tiny bodies furious at the sudden disturbance of their home. How did she end up in such a predicament? And why were my bees, usually so gentle, so incredibly enraged? My name is Sarah, and I live in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where nothing too exciting ever really happens. At least, that's what I used to think. Most days, my biggest concern was whether my tomatoes were getting enough sun or if my dog, Buster, had managed to sneak another treat. Life was simple, peaceful, and filled with the gentle hum of my beehives. Yes, I have beehives. 4 of them, to be exact, nestled safely in the back corner of my yard, hidden behind a tall fence and a tangle of sunflowers. Beekeeping started as a hobby a few years ago. I found it incredibly calming, watching the busy little bees work, creating something so sweet and natural. Plus, the fresh honey was a wonderful bonus, a golden reward for their hard work and mine. I often shared it with my neighbors, leaving small jars on their doorsteps, a little taste of our shared sunshine. Most people loved it, praising the rich flavor and thanking me for the unexpected treat. It was a small way to connect, to spread a little sweetness in the world. However, not everyone appreciated my buzzing residence. Ms. Evelyn Perkins, our HOA president, was not a fan. From the moment she moved in 2 years ago, she made it clear that my bees were an eyesore and a nuisance. She cited imaginary rules about livestock, even though bees are not livestock, and complained about potential stings, even though my bees are remarkably docile. Every few months, I would receive a stern letter from the HOA, always signed by Ms. Perkins, reminding me of some obscure bylaw or new, community standard that my bees supposedly violated. I patiently explained how vital bees are to our ecosystem, how they pollinate the very flowers in her meticulously manicured garden, and how I took every precaution to ensure they didn't bother anyone. I even offered her a jar of honey, hoping the sweetness would soften her stance. She refused, of course, with a dismissive wave of her hand and a sniff of disdain. One particularly sunny afternoon, a few weeks before the Great Bee Incident, I was harvesting honey. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and warm wax. I had my protective gear on, the suit, the veil, the gloves, and was carefully lifting frames heavy with golden honey. It was a meditative process, one I truly enjoyed. As I worked, I noticed Ms. Perkins peering over her fence, her eyes narrowed. She had a habit of observing my yard, often with a disapproving look on her face. I offered a friendly wave, but she merely scowled and quickly retreated inside. I thought nothing of it at the time, just another typical interaction with Ms. Perkins. Later that evening, I bottled the fresh honey, the jars gleaming on my kitchen counter. I set aside a few for my usual neighborly drop-offs, including a small one for my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who always loved my clover honey. The next morning, as I walked Buster, I saw Mrs. Henderson sitting on her porch swing, looking a bit downcast. She usually greeted me with a cheerful wave and a story about her grandchildren. "Everything all right, Mrs. Henderson?" I asked, a little concerned. She sighed. "Oh, Sarah, I don't know what's going on. My beautiful rose bushes, they just aren't blooming like they used to. And my apple tree, barely any fruit this year. It's just not right." My heart sank a little. I knew the importance of pollinators, and it sounded like her plants were suffering from a lack of them. I assured her I'd look into it, wondering if something was affecting the local bee population. Later that day, as I tended to my garden, I noticed something odd. The gate to my backyard, which I always kept securely latched, was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered latching it that morning after letting Buster out. A shiver of unease ran down my spine. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but it nagged at me. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I must have simply forgotten. But then, as I approached my beehives, I saw it. One of the hives, my newest one, seemed a little off-kilter, almost as if it had been nudged. My heart began to pound. Bees are incredibly sensitive to disturbances, and a hive being moved, even slightly, could agitate them. I gently checked the hive, listening to the buzzing within. It sounded normal, but the unsettling feeling remained. I secured the gate, double-checking the latch this time, and made a mental note to keep a closer eye on things. The next few days passed without incident, and I started to relax, chalking it up to my imagination. Then came the day of the annual neighborhood potluck, a tradition that brought everyone together for food, laughter, and a chance to catch up. I had made my famous honey-glazed chicken, using a generous amount of my fresh honey, of course. The aroma was incredible, and I was looking forward to sharing it. As I carried my dish towards the community park, I saw Ms. Perkins setting up her table, adorned with a rather sad-looking fruit salad. She caught my eye and offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The potluck was in full swing, and everyone was enjoying themselves. Kids were running around, dogs were wagging their tails, and the air was filled with chatter and the clinking of plates. I saw Mrs. Henderson happily chatting with some other neighbors, and I made a mental note to bring her some honey later that week. I had just finished serving myself a slice of honey-glazed chicken when I heard it, a high-pitched shriek, followed by a chorus of gasps. My head whipped around, and my eyes landed on Miss Perkins, who was now covered in a sticky, golden substance, her face contorted in a mask of horror. A small, overturned jar lay at her feet. It was my honey. The one I had given to Mrs. Henderson. Ms. Perkins, red-faced and sputtering, was trying to wipe the honey off her dress, but it was clinging stubbornly. "My dress! My beautiful dress," she cried, attracting even more attention. She glared at Mrs. Henderson, who looked utterly bewildered. "She gave it to me," Ms. Perkins accused, pointing a honey-soaked finger at the elderly woman. "She said it was from her garden." Mrs. Henderson, flustered, tried to explain. "No, Evelyn, I told you Sarah gave it to me. I thought you liked it." The scene was quickly becoming a spectacle, and I felt a knot of dread forming in my stomach. This was going to be a long potluck. The next morning, a formal letter arrived from the HOA, delivered by hand by a grim-faced Miss Perkins herself. It was a notice of violation, stating that my beehives were a public nuisance and a health hazard, citing the honey incident at the potluck as evidence. It demanded immediate removal of the bees. My hands trembled as I read the letter, my heart sinking with each accusatory word. This was more than just a complaint, it was an ultimatum. I knew Ms. Perkins was determined, but I had no idea she would go to such lengths. I looked out at my quiet backyard, at the gentle hum coming from my hives. My bees were not a nuisance, they were a vital part of our environment, and they brought me so much joy. I felt a surge of anger mixed with despair. What was I going to do? How could I fight the HOA, especially with Ms. Perkins leading the charge, seemingly fueled by a personal vendetta? The thought of losing my bees, of having to dismantle their home, was unbearable. I felt a deep sadness, a sense of injustice. I knew I had to do something, but what? The clock was ticking, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. The peace I once knew in my backyard now felt threatened, replaced by a looming battle. The battle lines had been drawn, and I knew I had to prepare for a fight. I just didn't know how intense that fight would become. The bees, my innocent, hard-working bees, were caught in the middle of a human conflict, and I was their only advocate. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on me, heavy and daunting. I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, after the jarring arrival of the HOA notice, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, frustration, and a deep-seated worry for my bees all swirled together. How could Ms. Perkins be so unreasonable? This wasn't just about honey, it felt like a personal attack. I knew I couldn't just give up. My bees were a part of me, and more importantly, they were good for the neighborhood. I spent the morning researching HOA laws, scouring online forums, and even calling a friend who was a lawyer, hoping to find some loophole, some way to fight back. The legal jargon was overwhelming, filled with terms like covenants, bylaws, and injunctions. It felt like trying to read a foreign language. My head started to ache, but I pressed on, determined to understand my rights. That afternoon, I decided to take a break from my legal deep dive and visited Mrs. Henderson. I wanted to apologize for the potluck incident, even though it wasn't my fault, and to check on her roses and apple tree. She welcomed me in with her usual warm smile, offering me a glass of iced tea. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a comforting scent. "Sarah, dear, don't you worry about Evelyn," she said, patting my hand. "She gets herself in a tizzy sometimes." Mrs. Henderson, with her kind eyes and gentle demeanor, always had a way of making things feel a little better. We walked out to her garden, and my heart sank again. Her once vibrant rose bushes were indeed looking sparse, and the apple tree had only a few stunted apples clinging to its branches. "It's just not right," she repeated, her voice laced with sadness. "My garden used to be so lively." I explained how important bees were for pollination, and how a healthy bee population was essential for healthy plants. "Maybe," I suggested, "if we show the HOA how much good the bees do, they'll understand." A flicker of hope appeared in her eyes. "You think so, dear?" she asked, a hopeful note in her voice. "It's worth a try," I replied, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about gardening, about the challenges of growing things, and about the surprising resilience of nature. It was a calming interlude, a brief escape from the stress of the HOA battle. The idea sparked a plan. If Ms. Perkins was going to use rules and regulations against me, I would use facts and community support. I decided to gather signatures from neighbors who appreciated my bees and the honey they produced. I drafted a petition, explaining the ecological benefits of bees, their gentle nature, and how they contributed to the beauty of our neighborhood's gardens. The next day, I started going door to door, petition in hand. Most people were incredibly supportive. "Your honey is the best, Sarah," Mr. Davies from across the street exclaimed, readily signing his name. "And my hydrangeas have never looked better since you got those bees." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had a stunning vegetable patch, nodded vigorously. "They're essential. Without them, my zucchini wouldn't stand a chance." Each signature was a small victory, a glimmer of hope that I wasn't alone in this fight. However, not everyone was receptive. When I knocked on the door of Mr. Harrison, a notoriously grumpy resident, he just grunted, slammed the door in my face, and muttered something about buzzing pests. It was a disheartening moment, but I tried not to let it get to me. I knew there would be obstacles, and not everyone would understand. The biggest challenge, of course, was avoiding Ms. Perkins herself. I saw her car in her driveway several times, and I would quickly change my route, not wanting to instigate another confrontation. I managed to gather a good number of signatures, a thick stack of papers that represented the support of my community. I felt a surge of pride, thinking about all the people who valued my bees. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was our fight. I planned to present the petition at the next HOA meeting, hoping the sheer number of signatures would sway the board. A few days later, a strange incident occurred. I was in my backyard, weeding my herb garden, when I noticed Buster, my usually playful golden retriever, acting strangely. He was sniffing intently at the base of one of my beehives, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles were raised, and he kept nudging the hive with his nose. This was unusual. Buster typically ignored the bees, knowing they were off limits. I cautiously approached, wondering what had spooked him. As I got closer, I saw it. A small, dark smudge on the wooden hive, right near the entrance. It looked like some kind of sticky residue. My heart pounded as I knelt down, sniffing it. It smelled faintly sweet, but also vaguely chemical. What was this? And why was Buster so agitated? He continued to growl, his eyes fixed on the spot. I carefully examined the hive, trying to figure out what the substance was. It was difficult to see clearly without disturbing the bees. The unsettling feeling I'd had when I found the gate ajar returned, stronger this time. It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been in my backyard, and they had done something to my hive. But why? And what was that sticky substance? Was it something harmful? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The HOA letter, Miss Perkins's accusations, the strange residue on the hive, it all felt connected, but I couldn't quite put the pieces together. I called my friend who was a beekeeper in another town, describing what I saw. She sounded concerned. "That's not good, Sarah," she said, her voice serious. "Someone might be trying to harm your bees." The word sent a chill down my spine. The thought of someone deliberately trying to hurt my innocent bees made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a nuisance anymore, this was something more sinister. I felt a surge of protectiveness for my little buzzing friends. I vowed to find out who was behind this and put a stop to it, no matter what it took. The stakes felt much higher now. This wasn't just about winning an argument, it was about protecting vulnerable creatures and ensuring their safety. The peace of my backyard felt shattered, replaced by a sense of unease and a grim determination. I knew I had to be vigilant, to watch, and to protect my bees from whatever threat was lurking. This small, sticky smudge had just escalated the entire situation, transforming it from a neighborhood dispute into something far more alarming. The sight of the sticky residue on the hive, and Buster's agitated reaction, churned in my mind long after I left Mrs. Henderson's. It wasn't just some random act, someone had deliberately tampered with my bees. This realization solidified my resolve. I knew I couldn't simply wait for the next HOA meeting. I needed to investigate. My first thought was to set up a camera, but I wanted to catch whoever it was in the act, or at least get clearer evidence. The simplest solution, I figured, was to observe. I began spending more time in my backyard, pretending to garden or read, but secretly keeping an eye on the beehives and the surrounding area. It felt a little silly at first, like I was playing a detective in a children's book, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. Days turned into a week, and my surveillance yielded nothing. The sticky substance remained, but no new incidents occurred. The bees seemed to be recovering, their usual industrious hum returning to the hives. I still felt a constant underlying tension, though. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, made me jump. Buster, too, remained vigilant, often sitting by the fence, occasionally letting out a low growl when a stray cat or squirrel dared to venture too close. His heightened awareness kept me on edge, a constant reminder that something was amiss. I found myself checking the hive repeatedly, almost obsessively, for any new signs of disturbance. The stress was starting to wear on me, my sleep was restless, filled with anxious dreams of angry bees and menacing shadows. One afternoon, as I was hanging laundry, I heard a faint, rhythmic thudding sound coming from Miss Perkins's backyard. It wasn't loud, just a dull, repetitive noise that seemed out of place in our usually quiet neighborhood. My curiosity, piqued by the earlier incidents, got the better of me. I crept closer to the fence, trying to get a better listen without being obvious. The thudding continued, interspersed with what sounded like muffled grunts. It was definitely coming from her yard, but what could it be? My mind raced, trying to imagine what Ms. Perkins, always so focused on appearances, could be doing that would create such a strange noise. Was she redecorating? Building something? The sound felt oddly mechanical, not like gardening or typical household chores. The thudding stopped abruptly. Then, a few minutes later, I heard the distinctive sound of a garden hose being turned on, followed by the splash of water. It was almost as if whatever she was doing required cleaning up afterward. This only deepened the mystery. I couldn't see anything over her tall fence, which felt frustratingly deliberate. The whole situation felt increasingly peculiar. Why the secrecy? Why the strange noises? My suspicions, which had been simmering beneath the surface, began to bubble up. Could Ms. Perkins be involved in the hive tampering? The thought seemed outlandish, yet given her animosity towards my bees, it wasn't entirely impossible. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just her doing some strange home improvement project, but the feeling of unease persisted. The following morning, I woke up early, still troubled by the mysterious thudding. As I made my coffee, I looked out my kitchen window towards Miss Perkins's house. To my surprise, her garage door was open, something I rarely saw. It was usually kept tightly shut, almost as if she were hiding something. A fleeting glimpse inside revealed a cluttered space, filled with boxes and gardening equipment. Then, my eyes caught something unusual. Tucked away in a corner, barely visible behind a stack of terracotta pots, was a large, industrial-looking container. It was dark green, with a bulky hose coiled next to it, and it looked remarkably similar to the kind of equipment used for spraying pesticides or herbicides. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Could she be spraying chemicals in her yard? And if so, what kind? And more importantly, could it affect my bees? I tried to shake off the growing paranoia, but the image of the sprayer wouldn't leave my mind. Bees are incredibly sensitive to pesticides, even small amounts can harm them. If she was using something strong, it could explain the sticky residue on my hive, and even Buster's reaction. But why would she spray my hive? It didn't make sense. Unless she wasn't trying to kill them directly, but just to make them leave. Or maybe she was trying to weaken them, to make them appear sickly, thus strengthening her argument to the HOA. The possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last, swirled in my head. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, a new, far more alarming event occurred. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when I heard a sudden, frantic buzzing coming from my backyard. It was louder than usual, more agitated, and filled with a frantic desperation. My heart leaped into my throat. I jumped up and raced towards the back of the house, Buster right on my heels, barking furiously. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks, a gasp escaping my lips. The scene before me was horrific. One of my beehives, the very one that had the sticky residue on it, was violently shaking. Bees were swarming out of the entrance in a frenzied, chaotic cloud, not in their usual orderly fashion, but in a panicked exodus. It was clear something terrible was happening. As I watched in horror, the hive tilted, then slowly, agonizingly, began to fall. A loud crack echoed through the quiet evening as it hit the ground with a sickening thud, sending a fresh wave of panicked bees scattering in every direction. The wooden structure was splintered, a sticky mess of honey and wax oozing onto the grass. It was utter chaos, a scene of pure destruction. My beloved bees, disoriented and terrified, were flying wildly, bumping into each other, some falling to the ground, twitching. A deep, primal scream tore from my throat. Someone had deliberately knocked over my hive. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a prank. This was an act of malicious destruction. My mind immediately flashed back to Ms. Perkins's open garage, the mysterious thudding, the chemical sprayer. A cold fury, unlike anything I had ever felt, consumed me. This was war. And my bees, my gentle, innocent bees, were the casualties. The sight of their destroyed home, the frantic buzzing of their displaced lives, filled me with an overwhelming need for justice. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was Ms. Perkins's doing. The question was not if she did it, but how I would prove it. The battle for my bees had just become a desperate fight for their survival, and I was ready to do whatever it took to protect them. The sight of the splintered hive, honey oozing onto the grass, ignited a burning rage within me. My hands shook as I knelt beside the wreckage, the desperate buzzing of my displaced bees a mournful chorus around me. This wasn't just about an HOA dispute anymore, this was a deliberate act of cruelty. My first instinct was to rush over to Ms. Perkins's house, to confront her, to demand an explanation for this senseless destruction. But then, a colder, more logical thought prevailed. Confrontation without proof would only escalate the situation further, playing right into her hands. I needed evidence, undeniable proof that she was behind this. The anger in my heart transformed into a steely resolve. I spent the rest of that evening carefully assessing the damage. The hive was beyond repair, a twisted mess of wood and wax. Thankfully, most of the bees, though disoriented and agitated, seemed to be alive, frantically trying to salvage what they could from their shattered home. I knew I had to act fast to protect them. Using an empty cooler and some spare frames, I carefully gathered as many bees as I could, coaxing them gently into their temporary shelter. It was a painstaking process, made even harder by the lingering shock and my profound sadness. Buster stayed close by, whimpering softly, sensing my distress. He was a good boy, always there when I needed him most. The air grew cool, and the sky darkened, casting long, eerie shadows across the ravaged hive. I worked tirelessly until it was too dark to see, my heart heavy with grief for my little buzzing community. The next morning, armed with a renewed determination, I began my investigation. I started by meticulously examining the ground around the destroyed hive, looking for any clues, any piece of evidence that Ms. Perkins might have left behind. The dew-covered grass revealed faint impressions, almost like footprints, leading away from the hive towards her fence line. They were too indistinct to be definitive, but they certainly pointed in her direction. Then, my eyes caught something glinting in the morning sun near the broken hive fragments. It was a small, shiny button, a fancy, decorative one, like something you'd find on a blazer or a coat. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It wasn't mine, and I didn't recognize it from any of my clothes or anything Buster might have brought in. But I had a strong feeling I knew exactly who it belonged to. A mess. Perkins was known for her impeccably tailored outfits, often adorned with elaborate buttons. This was the first tangible piece of evidence, a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I carefully wrapped it in a tissue, feeling a surge of triumph mixed with a chilling confirmation of my suspicions. Later that day, I decided to install a motion-activated camera. I purchased a small, discreet one, designed to look like a bird feeder, and positioned it strategically to capture the area around my remaining beehives, as well as the fence line bordering Ms. Perkins's property. It was a small but significant step toward securing my bees and gathering the evidence I desperately needed. The feeling of being watched, of constantly being on guard, was exhausting, but the image of my broken hive fueled my resolve. I knew I had to be patient, to wait for her to make another mistake. A few days passed without incident. The remaining bees were slowly settling into their undisturbed hives, their hum a little less frantic, a little more rhythmic. I continued to monitor the camera feed, but it only showed squirrels burying nuts and Buster chasing butterflies. The calm was unsettling, like the quiet before a storm. I knew Ms. Perkins wouldn't simply give up. Her animosity towards my bees felt too deeply rooted, almost personal. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning her next move, that this period of peace was just a temporary reprieve. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the house with its fury. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee. I was curled up on the couch with Buster, listening to the cacophony outside, when the power flickered, then died, plunging the house into darkness. I groaned, fumbling for my flashlight. These power outages were common during severe storms, but tonight, it felt particularly ominous. As the storm raged, a sudden, blinding flash of lightning illuminated my backyard, followed by an earth-shattering crack of thunder. In that brief, terrifying, I saw a shadowy figure lurking near my fence line, illuminated by the ghostly light. The figure was cloaked in a dark rain slicker, its hood pulled low, but even in that split second, I recognized the distinct, almost rigid posture. It was heading directly towards my remaining beehives. My blood ran cold. She was back. And she was going to finish what she started. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The power was out, the camera wouldn't be recording, and the storm was making it impossible to see clearly. Buster, sensing my terror, started barking furiously, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the dark house. I knew I couldn't let her harm my bees again. Not after everything. I grabbed the heaviest umbrella I could find, my makeshift weapon, and stumbled towards the back door, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. The rain felt like needles on my skin as I burst out into the storm, the wind whipping my hair around my face. The shadowy figure was still there, now closer to the hives. I yelled, "Hey! Get away from there!" My voice was swallowed by the howling wind and crashing thunder, but the figure paused, startled. It turned, and for a fleeting moment, as another flash of lightning lit up the sky, I saw it, the glint of something metallic in its hand, reflecting the electric light. It looked like a small, heavy hammer. And then, without hesitation, the figure raised the hammer and brought it down with full force onto one of my remaining beehives. A sickening crunch ripped through the storm, followed by the frantic, panicked buzzing of thousands of terrified bees. My vision tunneled with fury. She was truly trying to destroy everything. I wouldn't let her. I charged forward, screaming, determined to protect my bees, no matter the cost. The thunder cracked again, mirroring the rage in my heart, as I braced myself for the confrontation. My scream was swallowed by the storm's fury, but my charge was fueled by a primal instinct to protect. Rain slicked the grass beneath my feet as I lunged forward, the heavy umbrella clutched like a weapon. The shadowy figure, momentarily frozen by my sudden appearance, recoiled slightly. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, revealing Ms. Perkins, her face contorted in a snarl, the small hammer still poised above my now crumpled beehive. Her eyes, wide and wild, met mine for a terrifying instant, a mixture of shock and defiance in their depths. The sound of splintering wood and the frantic buzzing of disoriented bees filled the air, a symphony of destruction that only fueled my rage. "Stop it, Ms. Perkins!" I shrieked, my voice hoarse from anger and the effort of shouting over the storm. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan beyond simply flailing with an umbrella. She took a step back, her gaze darting nervously between me and the damaged hive. The hammer remained in her hand, a silent testament to her destructive intent. Buster, barking relentlessly at my side, was a furry, four-legged alarm, his barks adding to the chaotic symphony of the storm. He seemed to sense the immense danger, his protective instincts on full display. You can't prove anything." Ms. Perkins stammered, her voice thin and reedy against the wind. She tried to appear confident, but a tremor in her hand betrayed her fear. She began to back away slowly, her eyes still fixed on me, the hammer lowering slightly. The rain was relentless, plastering her dark slicker to her body, making her movements appear heavy and cumbersome. I kept advancing, the umbrella still raised, my eyes narrowed, refusing to let her escape. The image of my broken hive, the frantic, displaced bees, was burned into my mind, propelling me forward. Suddenly, a loud crack, sharper than any thunder, split the air directly above us. A large tree branch, weakened by the relentless wind and rain, snapped from a towering oak at the edge of my property. It began to fall, slowly at first, then picking up speed, directly towards Ms. Perkins. My heart leaped into my throat. Even in my anger, I couldn't wish harm upon her. "Look out!" I yelled, dropping the umbrella and instinctively shoving her forward with all my might, pushing her clear of the falling branch. The branch crashed to the ground with a resounding thud, narrowly missing her by mere inches. Ms. Perkins stumbled, landing hard on the wet grass, drenched and gasping, the hammer flying from her grasp and skittering across the lawn. The sudden shock of the near miss seemed to drain the aggression from her. She lay there for a moment, breathing heavily, soaked to the bone, her usual meticulously styled hair plastered to her face. The storm, as if sensing the climax of the drama, began to subside, the thunder rumbling off into the distance, the rain lessening to a gentle drizzle. The immediate danger had passed, but the tension in the air remained thick. I stood panting, my adrenaline slowly receding, my body trembling from the exertion and the emotional roller coaster. Buster, still keyed up, let out a few last, protective barks before nudging my hand. Ms. Perkins slowly pushed herself up, her eyes wide with a newfound vulnerability. The anger, the defiance, had been replaced by genuine fear. She looked at the fallen branch, then at me, then back at the branch, a silent realization dawning on her face. You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first time I had ever seen her truly vulnerable, stripped of her usual haughty demeanor. The cold fury that had consumed me began to dissipate, replaced by a strange mix of shock and a flicker of something akin to pity. The aftermath of the storm was strangely quiet, only the dripping of water from the trees and the faint, mournful hum of my remaining bees breaking the silence. I didn't respond to her statement directly, but knelt down to assess the damage to the second hive. It was dented and cracked, but thankfully, not completely destroyed like the first. The bees, though shaken, were slowly beginning to settle. As I worked, I could feel Ms. Perkins's eyes on me, a new, unreadable expression on her face. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and the raw emotion of the past few minutes. Then, from her side of the fence, a small, choked sob escaped her. I looked up, surprised. Ms. Perkins, the formidable HOA president, was crying. Tears mixed with the rain on her face as she struggled to speak. I don't know why I did it," she choked out, her voice filled with genuine remorse. I just wanted them gone. My husband, he was severely allergic to bees. He passed away suddenly a few years ago. Every time I heard your bees, it just brought back all the fear, all the pain. I know it wasn't right, what I did. I was scared. And angry. Her words were a torrent, a confession that caught me completely off guard. All this time, I had seen her as simply malicious, but there was a hidden pain, a deep-seated fear driving her actions. The anger I felt slowly began to melt away, replaced by a profound understanding and even a touch of sadness for her loss. The rain had stopped entirely, and the first hints of dawn were breaking through the clouds, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. The neighborhood, usually so peaceful, still bore the marks of the storm's fury. The realization of Ms. Perkins's personal tragedy shifted the entire dynamic of our conflict. It wasn't just about bees anymore, it was about grief, fear, and a desperate, misguided attempt to control something she felt threatened by. The metallic button I had found earlier, still in my pocket, suddenly felt less like a piece of incriminating evidence and more like a symbol of a deep, unseen wound. The air remained thick with unspoken apologies and the promise of a reckoning that would have to extend beyond mere legal battles. This was no longer just a dispute, it was a chance for healing, for empathy, and perhaps, for a surprising new beginning for both of us. The next steps would be crucial, not just for my bees, but for the fragile threads of our community. Ms. Perkins's confession hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her grief. The revelation of her husband's bee allergy and his sudden passing transformed her from a villain into a deeply wounded person. My anger, which had burned so fiercely moments before, now flickered and died, replaced by a profound sadness. I looked at her, truly saw her, for the first time, not as the imposing HOA president, but as a woman consumed by a silent sorrow. The broken hive, the frantic bees, even the button in my pocket, seemed to recede in importance, overshadowed by the raw human emotion laid bare between us. "Ms. Perkins," I began, my voice soft, almost a whisper. "I am so incredibly sorry for your loss. I had no idea." The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. She looked up, her eyes still red-rimmed, but a flicker of surprise crossed her face. Perhaps she expected anger, not empathy. I shouldn't have done what I did," she mumbled, her voice thick with regret. "It wasn't fair to you. Or your bees." The admission was humbling, a profound shift in our relationship. The stormy skies had given way to a fragile dawn, and with it, a glimmer of understanding. The rest of the morning was spent in a strange, quiet truce. Ms. Perkins, to my astonishment, stayed to help me salvage what I could from the damaged hive. Her movements were clumsy, hesitant, but her intent was clear. She carefully picked up scattered honeycombs, her hands sticky with the golden sweetness she had once despised. We worked side by side, two women who had been adversaries just moments before, now bound by an unexpected shared moment of vulnerability and repair. The rhythmic hum of the surviving bees, slowly settling back into their undisturbed hives, was a gentle backdrop to our silent efforts. It was a surreal experience, witnessing the transformation of a fierce opponent into an unlikely helper. Later that afternoon, after the last of the salvageable bees were safely relocated to a temporary hive, Ms. Perkins asked if she could speak with me, away from the chaos of the backyard. We sat on my porch, the very spot where I had heard the initial frantic buzzing that led to the confrontation. The air was fresh and clean after the storm, and the neighborhood felt quiet, almost serene. She told me more about her husband, David, a kind and vibrant man whose life was tragically cut short by a severe allergic reaction to a bee sting during a picnic. Her fear of bees wasn't just a phobia, it was a constant, agonizing reminder of her loss, a desperate attempt to control something that had taken so much from her. She spoke of her isolation, her inability to move past the grief, and how her fear had consumed her, leading her to irrational actions. She admitted to seeing me as a symbol of that fear, and her attempts to remove my bees were a misguided way of trying to erase her pain. I listened, truly listened, without interruption, my heart aching for her. It was a powerful reminder that everyone carries unseen burdens, that often, what appears as malice is simply a manifestation of deeper pain. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, she looked at me, her eyes clear for the first time. "I want to apologize, Sarah," she said, her voice steady. "For everything. The letters, the complaints, the destruction of your hive. It was wrong. I was wrong." She then offered to pay for the damaged hive and even to help me build new ones. Her sincerity was palpable, and a genuine warmth spread through me. It was a moment of profound reconciliation, a bridge built between us through shared vulnerability. The real surprise came a few weeks later. After consulting with a beekeeping expert I knew, and after Ms. Perkins had undergone a session with a grief counselor who helped her separate her fear from her husband's memory, we began to work on a solution for the neighborhood. Ms. Perkins, leveraging her position as HOA president, proposed a community initiative. Instead of banning bees, we would educate the neighborhood. We held workshops on bee safety, teaching people about gentle bee behavior and how to coexist peacefully. I gave presentations on the vital role of pollinators, and Mrs. Henderson, with her flourishing garden, became a living testament to the bees' positive impact. Ms. Perkins even spearheaded the creation of a pollinator garden in a neglected corner of the community park, planting bee-friendly flowers and setting up a small, observation-friendly beehive, the community hive, that I would manage. She became its most ardent champion, often seen tending to the flowers, and even, cautiously, observing the bees from a safe distance. She confessed to me, with a small smile, that the gentle hum no longer filled her with dread, but with a quiet sense of hope. The neighbors, initially wary, were impressed by her transformation and embraced the initiative. The community, once divided by a trivial dispute, was now brought together by a shared understanding and a commitment to nurturing nature. The biggest, most astounding twist, however, came during the annual neighborhood fair, held a few months later. Ms. Perkins, usually reserved and aloof, approached my honey stand, a genuine smile on her face. She held out a small, intricately carved wooden box. "Sarah," she said, "I wanted to give you this. It's a token of my sincere apology, and my gratitude." Inside the box, nestled on a bed of velvet, was the small, decorative button I had found near my destroyed hive. My breath caught in my throat. This was the final, undeniable proof, a silent confession of her actions. But instead of accusation, it was now a symbol of forgiveness and transformation. "And," she continued, her eyes twinkling with a mischievous glint, "I brought something else." She reached into a large, insulated bag she was carrying. From it, she pulled out several jars of her own homemade, carefully cultivated honey, each label proudly proclaiming, "Ms. Perkins's pollinator nectar." My jaw dropped. Ms. Perkins, the woman who had sought to destroy my bees, was now a beekeeper herself, or at least, a highly enthusiastic honey producer. She explained, a little sheepishly, that she had been secretly taking beekeeping classes, learning about the very creatures she once feared. She had even convinced a few other wary neighbors to join her. She then announced to the gathering crowd, her voice clear and strong, that all proceeds from her honey sales would go towards a new neighborhood pollinator fund, dedicated to protecting bees and promoting local ecosystems. The crowd erupted in applause. Ms. Perkins, once the HOA Karen of my nightmare, stood there, beaming, surrounded by the very community she had once alienated, now fully embraced as a champion of what she once opposed. The irony was sweet, literally. My bees, once the cause of so much strife, had become the unlikely catalyst for profound change, for understanding, and for a surprising, wild ending to a story that began with destruction but ended in a blossoming of kindness and community. The buzzing of the bees, once a source of conflict, now echoed with a harmonious promise of a brighter, sweeter future for everyone.